Okay, here's the recorded version. The one you saw on Headline already, if you already clicked on it, is just the PowerPoint because this wasn't working. So now that it's working, let me just explain what I want you to do. You're supposed to take notes, first of all, and the second thing you're going to need to do is to write a timeline. The timeline is going to go from the Precambrian time all the way up to the Quaternary period, which is where we live right now. I'll let you know when to start doing the timeline, but until then, just take notes. Um, what we're talking about now is the history of life on Earth. Evolution, or the theory of evolution, does not try to explain how life originated. It just it tries to explain how it developed once it existed. So we're going to start with the beginning of geologic time. And as far as we're concerned, um, the Earth seems to be about between 4 to 6 billion years old. We say this because the oldest rocks we found by not radiocarbon dating, by radiometric dating, has given us an age of around 6 billion years. So we think between 4 and 6 billion years, just giving ourselves a little leeway for accuracy. And that's a very long time. And I think we talked about before in class that a billion seconds is 32 years. Okay, I've lived a billion seconds and you have not. So with that in mind, just think about how long a billion years is and how much can possibly happen in that time. The reason we know this is, like I said, through chemistry and uh, looking at the half-life of certain isotopes of certain elements we can find in the Earth's crust. So let me move on. We talked about carbon-14 already, so you're familiar with that. Earth would have started out very hot because Earth formed by pieces of debris coming together, kind of like a snowball rolling down a hill. You know, the snowball gets bigger as it rolls down the hill. The Earth would have picked up debris through space as the universe was expanding. As things would hit it, it would get hotter, and we figure what probably would have happened is something really large would have hit it, possibly the same thing that knocked a piece off, which is the moon. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the moon is made of the same materials as Earth is, and scientists believe that what it is actually a piece of Earth that over many, possibly billions of years, has turned itself into that spherical shape that we can see now. But anyway, when whatever it was hit the Earth, you would have gotten an impact that released a ton of heat. And I don't know if you know this, but when you collide two large, massive bodies with each other, you will generate a massive amount of heat. You can demonstrate this with metal balls. They might have some in the physics department, but you can put a piece of paper between two metal balls, clack them together, and when you take the balls away and look at the paper, you'll see there's a hole burned in the center of it. So that's just to explain that heat is released when two massive objects collide. So the Earth would have gotten very hot, enough to melt the entire Earth. As that happened, the Earth would have become fairly liquid. When it's liquid, things that are less dense will float to the top. And when things float to the top, that means we'll have the lighter elements either in the crust or on the atmosphere, and the heavier elements will be down at the core. That's where we find iron and nickel, which are some of the heaviest things we find on Earth. So you can see this right here. You can see the crust forming right now as the Earth cools. So, formation of Earth. Next thing is the atmosphere of Earth. The early atmosphere would have had a bunch of different gases in it, none of which could support life as we know it now. And that was things like hydrogen cyanide, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, hydrogen, water. And you can read, so you know that. But this water was vapor, so that means it wasn't liquid. And water vapor, I don't know if you know this, but it's not the same thing as steam. Water vapor is water that's dissolved in the air, so to speak. It's kind of like when it's a humid day outside, you can feel the water in the air, but you can't see it. The one thing you'll see that's missing is oxygen. And one of the things you'll notice that when you have an atmosphere high in carbon dioxide, you end up with this pinkish color. And when you go to Mars and you look at the pictures from Mars, you can see that they indeed have a pink tint to the atmosphere when you look at those pictures. So the first kinds of things that would have shown up that we would have considered living would not have required oxygen. There's still some of those things alive on the Earth today, such as down in the hydrothermal vents in the deep ocean, or in the geysers and thermal pools at Yellowstone National Park. I don't know if you've ever seen those, but let me show you real quick. There's one famous one called Morning Glory Pool. Let's see if we can pull that up real quick. Although I got a slow internet connection, it may not be that fast. Let's see what happens here. Click my little images button. Here we go. It looks like this. This thing is really hot. So when you look down in there, all those different weird colors you see there are caused by um, ancestral bacteria we call archaea. And they're very good at living in extreme environments, such as you would have found on the early Earth. You know, the water in these pools is over 180 degrees. Not quite boiling, but getting close. All right, let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so this experiment that you see diagrammed here was done by Stanley Miller and I believe Robert Urey back in 1953. Here's what they did. So you can see right here there's a Bunsen burner heating a flask full of water. The water boils, steam and water vapor are released, and they go into this little chamber right here. The chamber is filled with things that Miller and Urey thought would represent the early Earth's atmosphere, like methane and ammonia and hydrogen gas. You see it in there. And then they also had these little electrodes that would simulate lightning, which would have been present on the Earth. It did have a weather system. So what they did is they forced the water vapor and all these other chemicals and electricity, which would provide energy, into this chamber. And as the water cooled, see this thing right here, basically you send cold water in here and then pump it back out again, and that cools what's going down in this pipe right here. The two things are not connected. The cooled water, it found out when they pulled this little stopper out and checked in this flask, they found amino acids in there. Amino acids are much more complicated than the stuff they put in, than the methane and ammonia and hydrogen. So what they're proving is that you could make complex organic macromolecules from less complex things. So by putting energy in, you're able to create the molecules that are necessary for life. However, they weren't right about the composition of the atmosphere. Like this methane and ammonia and hydrogen were not necessarily part of the atmosphere. And when they retried the experiment using the proper components, the proper gases, they didn't get the amino acids. And so they thought that they were done. They were wrong. But what ended up happening is that they were making nitrites, and the nitrites would immediately degrade the amino acids as soon as they were produced. So they tried it again, and they did get the amino acids. And what's more, they also got uracil and they got cytosine, which are two of the things that form RNA. And that's really important because RNA is what we use to code for proteins, and that's a very important step on the way to life. Here's some of the ways that life could have originated. I put viruses on here, even though they're around now. They're much simpler forms, and a lot of times they're considered to not be alive, but they're highly ordered and highly structured, and they're run by RNA, sometimes by DNA, but this one right here is run by RNA. This is the influenza virus, the one that gives you the flu. So you can see how complicated it is. It's got a lipid envelope, it's got a phospholipid bilayer. This thing looks very much like a cell. The only thing it doesn't have is the ability to live on its own without a host. And you could argue that that's not necessary for life, but the way we've laid out the characteristics of life so far, viruses are considered not alive. I kind of think they are. There are also these things up here, coacervates and microspheres. What they are is kind of like little bubbles, like little lipid bubbles. And coacervates are interesting because what they have in them are enzymes that can perform a certain task. These aren't considered alive because they aren't able to metabolize, but they can do little jobs and produce certain molecules in the presence of other molecules. So like Miller and Urey were proving, you can take less complicated things and make more complicated things out of it. That's a step on the way to life. Prokaryotic cells. These are the earliest forms of life that we do know about that did exist. And we can find these things in the fossil record. And they first started things like cellular respiration, taking glucose and breaking it down and releasing carbon dioxide and energy. Also photosynthesis, being able to store energy from the sun. The early prokaryotes, you can see a bunch of them here. There are a lot of microfossils of these things. You usually find them in the bottom of the ocean, in the limestone that would have formed down there. And these guys would have been doing photosynthesis. And as they do photosynthesis, you remember it produces oxygen as a byproduct. That oxygen in the atmosphere is going to be extremely important for the life that comes after them. The ozone layer is also going to be produced because ozone is O3, which is derived from oxygen gas, which is O2. The ozone layer protects us from ultraviolet radiation, which is bad for a lot of different forms of life. The sky would have turned blue also because of the presence of oxygen and the ozone layer. based on something called Rayleigh scattering. A lot of the different forms of life that uh, basically treated oxygen like a poison, there's things called anaerobic bacteria, anaerobic archaea. These are things that don't need oxygen, and sometimes oxygen is poisonous to them. And those would have gone extinct. They either went extinct or they found a new environment where they could survive, such as those pools in Yellowstone or the hydrothermal vents down into the ocean. Here you can see some of the variations in carbon dioxide and oxygen that we've recovered from the fossil record in rocks and in ice cores. So this kind of shows you that there's a big peak in oxygen as plants started to arrive, as photosynthetic organisms started to arrive. And you also see that carbon dioxide will also drop as a result. Eukaryotic cells are a little bit different. They require membranes on the inside, not just on the outside. And you can see in here you got chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are very closely related to those archaea we were talking about that could do photosynthesis. There are also things called cyanobacteria, which are very similar to chloroplasts. Take a look at this. I'm going to pause it for a second, but look at all these and make sure you understand what's going on. Alright, did you get it? Basically what's going on, like this is a good introductory one right here. You can see that you start with two independent bacteria, the purple one and the green one. The green one kind of eats the purple one but never digests it. It stays living inside it. And if it produces something, like for example, it produces glucose that the green cell can eat, that's helpful. That's an advantage. So they'll continue to be passed on. The way it actually gets passed on, if you look over here, you can see a cyanobacterium. This is going to be a chloroplast in the end. And this is a eukaryotic cell that has a nucleus. Once the chloroplast comes in here, what it does is transfer the genes that it uses to build itself to the nucleus of the cell that already exists there. Sometimes also, this cell can be eaten by a larger cell. The two nuclei will merge. This is called a nucleomorph. It's going to actually merge with this nucleus. They're going to fuse and share their genetic information, and then you've got a more complex cell. So this would explain how you get things like mitochondria and chloroplasts into one cell. Alright, let's talk about sex. The first thing you have to have is multicellular organisms. Multicellularity means that you have several different cells working together to make an organism that is complete, possibly with different organs, different organ systems that all work together, digestive system, a nervous system. All these things have different cells all working together. You can't just split an organism like that in half. You can't use asexual reproduction. You can't clone it, and you can't just cut it in half and expect each one to grow independently. If you cut a person in half, you end up with a dead person. You don't get two new people. So, you have to use sexual reproduction. Basically what you do is you need to shuffle your genes, shuffle your genetic information, put it into a haploid gamete that only has one version of each trait, merge it with someone else's haploid gamete, and get a diploid organism. This makes diversity. This is why things look different. This is why you don't look the same as your brother and sister. Either way, this is one of the likely things that led to what we call the Cambrian explosion, and that's a quote-unquote explosion of multicellular life we see in the fossil record at a time we call the Cambrian period. Everything before that we called the Precambrian period, because Precambrian time was everything before that, and there was only a few living things at the end of this period. And that takes up 90% of the history of the Earth. Life only shows up at the end of that. Okay, what I want you to do right now is you're going to start doing your timeline. So you're going to start it with the Precambrian time, and then we're going to move into the Paleozoic era, which starts with the Cambrian period. Remember, eras are longer than periods. Eras usually contain several periods. So you're going to divide up your timeline. And you can always look on the internet and see if you can find another one. I'm not going to say much. I'm just going to flip through the slides, and you can put together your timeline. I'm going to check this on Friday. Okay? Go. Okay, make sure you pause it because I'm going to go kind of fast. Here we go. And that's it.